In this video, we're going to talk about the book of Genesis and how to interpret it in light of the whole Bible. Joining me today is Professor Richard Belcher, who is professor of Old Testament at Reformed Theological Seminary in Charlotte and the author of a commentary on Genesis, and we'll use that today as part of our conversation. So, Dick, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Why don't we start with the name of your commentary before I forget to ask that? It's got a subtitle to it, and you can talk a little bit about it.
Yeah, Genesis, the beginning of God's plan of salvation. It's in the Focus on the Bible series published by Christian Focus, and it has a lot of detailed explanation of the text, but it's really meant to be more of a big picture. That series is more of a big picture focus on the meaning of a book.
Well, why don't we start there? Tell us, what is the big picture of Genesis? It has the creation of the world in it, but what role does it play in the Bible, in the history of redemption and so forth?
Yeah, Genesis is very foundational, not only to the Old Testament, but also to the rest of Scripture, because it has creation and the events that take place after creation. I think Moses wrote it to remind God's people that the God that they worship is the creator of the universe, and that he has a plan to restore creation because of the entrance of sin through the redemption of his people. So you have creation in Genesis 1, Genesis 2, God provides everything that Adam and Eve need, but then Genesis 3, you have the entrance of sin into the world. And Genesis sort of shows you the early plan of God. The first 11 chapters, the pervasive nature of sin leading to the flood, and then you've got the Tower of Babel. So you've got the human sinfulness is sort of standing in the way of God's plan of redemption. Of course, God is sovereign, but then in chapter 11 and 12, God changes direction and chooses one particular person, Abraham, and his family. And then the rest of Genesis is really a story of Abraham, primarily Jacob and Joseph, the line, if you will, that God is going to use to bring salvation ultimately to his people and to restore creation. But Genesis ends with Joseph in Egypt and Jacob and his family coming down to Egypt, 12 sons that become, in the book of Exodus, the nation of Israel, which God uses then as a part of his plan to reach the nations in the context of the Old Testament. So you've got major things going on in Genesis, and even a lot of the discussions today, marriage, gender. I mean, God lays out his purposes for humanity here at the beginning chapters of Genesis. So it really is foundational in many ways.
Well, you mentioned there Abraham, and you've written on the covenants of God elsewhere. And maybe you could say a few words about the covenants, or at least some of the covenants in Genesis, and how that relates to this plan of redemption.
Sure. And we could start with God's response to sin in Genesis 3, which is a response of both curse because of sin, but also you have what's called the first gospel message, I guess, the first Evangelion there in Genesis 3:15, where God promises to send someone from the seed of the woman to defeat the serpent. That's good news. Adam responds there in faith by naming his wife Eve, the mother of all living. In other words, Adam believes that God's purposes are going to continue. And I would call this kind of the initiation of what we call the covenant of grace, covenant of works in Genesis 1 and 2, which Adam and Eve rebelled against. And then the covenant of grace initiated. And then you have the pervasive nature of sin, which God responds to with the flood. And then after the flood, you have the covenant with Noah, which is really a broader covenant that God promises that creation will continue as a backdrop for redemption, God's redemption to continue. Seed time and harvest will continue. And then, as we said earlier, God transitions, if you will, to choose one individual and his family to work out his purposes of redemption. That's Abram early on, and he calls him from the Ur of the Chaldeans to go to a land that I will show you. And in Genesis 12 is where all the promises that God makes to Abram, and those promises then are ratified in a covenant ceremony in Genesis 15. And what's significant about that ceremony is typical ceremony in ancient Near East. You would kill animals, cut them in half, spread them, and usually both parties of the covenant would walk between the slain animals, and you would be saying, if I don't keep the terms of the covenant, may what happened to these animals happen to me. Well, if you remember the story, Abraham goes into a deep sleep. God puts him into a deep sleep, and then God himself in the flaming torch is the one who passes through the animals. He is making a firm commitment that he is going to keep the promises that he has made to Abram. And you also have in Genesis 15, at the beginning there, Abram's concerned about one of those promises. He needs one person to be an heir so that the descendants, God promised many descendants, and Abraham is suggesting that Eliezer would be his heir because Sarah is barren, but God says, no, someone's going to come from your body, if you will, and he takes him out and shows him the stars and says, so will your descendants be. And Abraham believed God, and Genesis 15 says it was accounted to him of righteousness. So that's also a very important passage. And then God, in response to Abraham's question about the land and inheriting it, God does the covenant ceremony. And then you have chapter 17. In chapter 16, one of the challenges with Abram is he's got the promises of God, but will he live his life in light of those promises? And I think that's a lot about what the story of Abraham is about. And he kind of makes a left turn there with Hagar because Sarah is not having a child. And so he comes up with a human plan. And after that, then in chapter 17, what I call sort of a confirmation of the covenant, maybe a covenant renewal. You have the covenant of circumcision, which also emphasizes the seed aspect there in chapter 17. And Abraham's covenant really is foundational to the rest of the covenants because the promises that God makes to Abraham in that covenant are incorporated into the rest of the covenants in the Old Testament. The Mosaic covenant, the Davidic covenant, and each of those covenants have their own distinctive emphasis. But those promises God made to Abraham are continue. And in fact, God tells Moses, I heard the cry of my people in Egypt in bondage, and I'm, remembered my covenant. So it's helpful to see the interrelationship of the covenants together, and those promises continue. So Abrahamic covenant is very important, very foundational to the rest of Scripture. And of course, you get to the New Covenant, and a lot of these promises in the Old Testament are fulfilled in a fuller way with the coming of Christ.